I'd like to welcome you all. Everyone's complaining about the government, the federal government, isn't it wonderful? Nothing's changed, of course, and nothing will. What I'm surprised about is that people don't understand that companies don't keep profits. And the big debate today, of course, is on whether the tax should be cut from companies. Well, most companies don't make any profits, but those who are lucky enough to make profits, they either spend the money, like in investments, or they give it back to the shareholders. In this case, in Australia, most of the shareholders are the workers, so I can't see why Labor's not in favour of it. The issue, of course, is that by the Labor and the Greens opposing the bill, it means that they'd prefer higher taxes on corporations, and government spends the money, God help us. So what you have then is, of course, more money spent by governments, not by industry, because you need money to invest. Michelle Levine and I learnt this the hard way. We had a joint venture with MIM in our mining industry, and they took into account how much tax they had to pay on the profits. And then we realised, of course, if the tax is higher, the less value they put on our mine, which was, of course, unfortunate. We still got 20 million out of them. But that was 20 years or 30 years ago. Now, today is very important for us at Roy Morgan Research because we're, Michelle and our people who work in the automobile industry are going to discuss and go through where the industry is at. I joined Roy Morgan Research in 1959, and when I did my first survey was the customer satisfaction on General Motors cars, Holdens. And my father in the 1940s did all the work for Ford in Australia. I've still got the reports. Attitude towards the Ford Motor Company, and it was the leading car manufacturer in Australia. He worked with them until about 1959, and then they decided that we were old-fashioned and didn't know how to do market research, and they decided to use smarter market researchers than us, and their market share declined ever since. And now they're not here. They're not here. So that is the end of Ford. General Motors work with us, have worked with us, Holden have worked with us from the day they started. We did all their customer satisfaction. A man named Tony Winkelman, whose father was the Dutch ambassador, he established with us the question on intention to purchase new cars, and he was a great user of consumer confidence and intention information for helping Holden in Australia do their planning on manufacturing cars. And we are still working with General Motors today, and I said to John here that Holden pulled their ads off the internet, YouTube today, and hopefully that was part of our new system, Roy Morgan Media, which tells you where people go on the internet. And of course there's some political issues on YouTube, but today marketing of cars is done on the internet much more than in newspapers, of course. So then Toyota arrived in Australia, and I wrote for them, designed for them, their first customer satisfaction survey in the world. And they used that questionnaire because many years later I was at a Gallup International Conference, and the questionnaire was a questionnaire I wrote. So in their customer satisfaction, and that was in the 60s and 70s. And General Motors, Toyota, our last client in employee research down at Fisherman's Bend. We did their employee research down there, and of course they're now going to close it. Michelle will explain a lot of these issues today. It's not for me to take the punch out of her talk, of course. But so all I want to say is welcome here. You're our friends, you're our business associates, and you're part of Melbourne. And we just a little bit of housekeeping. We have been given notice to move out of this building, and we will be out of this building in either 3 or 9 months, and we will then have our office in Michelle's building in Flinders Lane, Tonic House, where where a lot of upmarket weddings are held today, around the back. What? With your children. Okay, now it's just 8 o'clock coming up, Michelle. We're waiting for the last... Ex-Justice Rush has arrived, and we didn't want to start before he came. So he told me he's arriving at 8. He's arrived, so now the show can begin. Over to you, Michelle.
Okay, great. Now we've heard the history. We're going to hear from a mobility futurist, and my job is to try and put it all together and make sense of it. But look, before we do that, let me tell my one story. In the year 2000, Roy Morgan had decided global domination was the path for us, and we'd set up the Roy Morgan Single Source Survey in America and had gone to see a whole range of clients, one of the potential clients. One of them was General Motors Holden, and we landed in their kind of future innovation division. There was a beaut man called Vince Barabbas, who I immediately warmed to. And he said, absolutely, want to be part of this value study, Michelle. And I said, look, here's the questions we have on cars. He says, no, I'm not interested in cars. He said, we're looking to a world where people don't own cars, where cars are something that's totally different. And I thought, great, just buy the survey, but you are smoking something that I don't smoke, and so they actually did buy the data. Then the global financial crisis hit. As basically the week we were delivering data, that whole division was closed. There was actually nowhere to deliver the database. But I think the key thing is the kind of thinking and the kind of change that's being foreshadowed and being experienced now isn't something that might happen. It isn't something that people have been thinking about for the last 2 weeks. In 2000, companies were actually preparing for this, and I, in my typical way, said, nah, never going to happen. So our job here at Roy Morgan is to produce the information about where things are today and guide the thinking about where it might go in the future. Hang on. Got it. So here's the agenda. There are actually sort of 4 key trends that are shaping the future of the automotive industry, or the economic engine that's the automotive industry, and that drives many, obviously, allied industries. In just a couple of minutes, I'd like to introduce you to Scott Browning, our mobility futurist, and he'll share with us his wisdom around where the automotive industry is heading. So we'll come back to these 4 key themes: the quest to zero emissions, driverless cars, urban mobility, and rethinking the whole notion of owning cars, and digital disruption. We'll hear from Scott, then we'll come back to look at the automotive industry today and the kind of near future as far as we can see, and then come back to bringing these 2 things together, the future and the present, with a view to trying to steer a course through all of that. So, can I introduce Scott Browning? And I also have an introduction here by Ross Honeywell, who's the head of the Centre for Economics, for Social Economics. And so let me just say, Scott Browning is a mobility futurist. You'll learn what that is in just a minute. He was head of marketing at JB Hi-Fi for many years, and Scott claims to have helped disrupt the retail technology sector. Now he's the co-founder of a future mobility startup. So basically, Scott's been disruptive. He's been disrupted. He's actually had the advantage of looking and being part of a whole range of industries as they went through extraordinary change. So he's really well positioned to tell us what he thinks is happening in the automotive industry. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Michelle. Look, there's a very fine line between being disrupted and being disturbed. So hopefully at the end of the presentation you'll come to some conclusion about that. So I've been called both. So where is the auto industry heading? There's no question that it's heading in a direction that over the next 5 to 10 years, the auto industry and those that are involved with it are going to see more change and more transformation than the industry has seen in the last 50 to 75 years. It's the auto industry is sort of a seemingly impregnable ship. It's heading at breakneck speed into an icy sea, a very unpredictable sea of disruption. So, to carry on that metaphor, from 100 years ago, there's another sort of unsinkable ship that was on that journey. But, contrary to widespread reports, it wasn't an iceberg that sunk the Titanic. It was a lack of understanding of brand purpose by management. It was a childlike optimism in a very advanced but highly flawed technology, and there simply weren't enough lifeboats. That is what made that whole thing a disaster. Step forward to another industry with a similar transformation, including the failing of an industry supergiant in that, which was Kodak. And I've got a well-worn path on this one. I was at Kodak for over 15 years in senior management. I was working for them right up to the impact point, just as it scraped along the side to realise what was going on. And by that time, I was moving on. But when people sort of asked me, was it digital photography that sunk Kodak? I don't believe it was. I think it was a lack of understanding by brand purpose by management. It was a childlike optimism in a very advanced but flawed technology, and there weren't enough lifeboats. The same story again. And then, I was fortunate enough to catch a lifeboat in 2003 from Kodak, but as you can see, by all means, that was really much on its way at that stage. What type of idiot gets off one disruption into another, from digital photography into music? So, I thought I was very clever. I'd stolen a dress, put on a lady's hat, found some kid wandering in steerage, and got in line for the lifeboats to get a priority pick. However, I'd realised that, the music industry was just about to go through the same thing, and I was Chief Marketing Officer of JB Hi-Fi for 11 years from that point. Fortunately, there was a couple of other Kodak executives on that lifeboat, and, we all understood, where Kodak had gone wrong. And today, JB Hi-Fi is probably not defined as a music retailer, but it was back then, and a lot of the pundits had underscored that business and said, it wouldn't make it. And when people ask me, says, well, why was JB Hi-Fi such a success? Certainly had nothing to do with my presence, but, we, as a management team and as staff, we had a clear understanding of brand purpose. We were dubiously cautious about advanced technologies, particularly in the middle of them that were sustaining businesses. We had a healthy scepticism of any of those advanced technologies. And we made sure we had plenty of lifeboats. Instead of building one big ship, JB Hi-Fi was a sort of a flotilla of ships that was able to come to the aid of other ships in the flotilla at different points in time, the way the business model was structured. So we were very conscious. We were actually very pessimistic about the future, and I think a lot of that had to do, with what we went through at Kodak. And we saw off that disruption in the music industry. 45% of JB Hi-Fi's profits in 2003 was coming from music. And here it is today. It's still I think it's about the 6th largest music retailer in the world in a physical sense, but it's not defining its destiny. And while I was at Kodak, I also had the pleasure of working with another company that was on an interesting journey very closely. That company was Apple. They're an amazing business to work for. I wouldn't say dealing with Apple was a huge pleasure. I sort of sometimes likened it to going to prison for sex. There was no question you got a lot of it, but it was rough. It was rough. So, but they were unrelenting in their attitude towards their brand purpose. They really understood how and why they existed. From the CEO right down to the people at the front line, they had a clear vision of what their purpose was. And for a technology company, they were very unimpressed with present technology and were always trying to disrupt it. They were always looking for lifeboats. And that created a large success, in the communications industry. So I think there's a lot of parallels there with what's going on with industry transformation. And that is that products become experiences in the mind of the consumer. And technology evolves, from a very low friction environment to a very high friction environment to low friction. But changes and disruption don't generally come from just changes in technology. There's lots of coincidences that need to happen. There's lots of multiple technologies that all converge at a certain time and place to make something work. Ideas that are generally, that tend to take over the world that look obvious, are usually around for a very long time. It's just that these things tend to take a little bit longer to work. And so old economies fragment into new economies, and this is a big challenge for incumbent businesses running large industries. How do we make that transition? When we're trying to protect the legacy model and make certain investments, just like the lifeboat analogy, it's false economy not to invest in possible new business models. Not just R&D and product and development, but new business models that change the social attitudes and new technologies that converge in the future that you have no control over. And there's this trend from sort of very fixed, ownership-based, high-cost environments into far more fluid, access, near-free environments with all systems that are used. And as things converge, the cost of things become augmented. People say, how much do you spend on photography? You say, I don't spend anything on photography now. It's all free. I'm on Facebook. I use my phone to take my pictures. I don't spend as much as anybody ever used to. But, a large majority of the cost of this device is actually a camera. Probably over 70% when you think of the battery and the technology and everything else that goes into this device is actually a camera. And instead of changing that every 10 years like we used to, we're changing that every 2 now. A large percentage of your cellular cost of your mobile network is on the move to upload photos and move images around. So you're probably spending more on photography than you ever have. You just don't think you are. And that augmentation of cost is probably the most telling things. And obviously there's a huge reduction in the cost per unit of production with those type of things. And that opens up opportunities for other industries to get involved, other business models, other value operators to look at how they bundle these things to make it more useful. And brand relevance then for incumbents is quite critical. If you're working in the new economy, the big issue is getting capital. If you're working in the old economy, is when do I invest, but how do I divest without turning up the apple cart? So a big challenge at Kodak was not about where to invest, but also how to divest, when to start moving on factories and people and those type of things. These were big challenges. But even in 2002, Kodak actually had a business strategy which was almost identical to the combination of Instagram and Facebook. It was shelved because nobody could work out how to make money of it. Instead, in 2003, the company spent $1 billion building a factory in China to make film. And that's because they thought, well, these people haven't even owned cameras yet, and that's how we're going to invest $1 billion and not waste $100 million on something like Friendster. And that's a blast from the past. Friendster was the precursor to MySpace, and that became Facebook, obviously. But the opportunities are always there, but the need to invest in new business models. So here we are today with a business model that is very high cost, fixed, and based on private ownership. The average car sits idle for 23 hours a day. That's 13 million private vehicles in Australia sit idle, owned by one person, and a very high cost per 1,000 kilometres travelled. Cost per kilometre is the key utilisation unit in the industry. So we're paying for a lot of standing costs. Not only that, in terms of fit for purpose, we generally buy a vehicle that is fit for multiple purposes at different times of its life. You've seen the explosion in SUVs because sometimes it's actually very convenient to own an SUV for the family. But probably only 10 or 12% of trips on a day-to-day basis or utilisations actually would require an SUV, if that. And yet, so the family invests a large amount of money in something that's actually never using. Not only are they not using it, it's not fit for purpose at the same time. And that's because the model doesn't allow that. So where is it going? It's got to go into an environment that actually will be low cost in some way. But what does that look like? When is it going to happen? When was the inflection point for this industry? Because a lot of these things can be traced back to an inflection point. Not the discovery of an idea or a technology, but a dramatic change where some idea actually made its way into the commercial arena and was being utilised to make money. The inflection point for the automotive industry came in 2008, 2009. Already the mining industry at a commercial level has been using autonomous vehicles. That's not news to everybody. And Google started developing their product in 2009. They didn't tell anybody to 2014, but for 5 years they were already doing their wayfinding analysis on automotive. So the industry has an inflection point now that's nearly 10 years behind us. That is telling. The industry consensus shows over the next 15 to 20 years, you see that orange bar there, that's the current business model today, personally owned, driver driven. The number of miles driven in the US. So between now and the middle of the second decade, that business model will be disrupted significantly in terms of personally driver driven. To that, by the middle of the century, a very small percentage of miles driven will be personally owned, driver driven. The vast majority, the green and the blue, will be some form of shared. The blue is autonomous, not just a purely an on-demand driven service. Very small amount of people will own privately autonomous vehicles because there simply just won't be a need. And there are changing attitudes. My daughter can't tell the difference between these two appliances. In fact, on a day-to-day basis, we have bigger crises in our household in relation to the failure of one of these appliances. It is not the car. So it is important to understand that this current generation of people, myself and my parents, had a different attitude towards cars for a number of reasons. But right now, today, Generation Y, Gen Z, they barely live a waking hour offline. Friends, family, work, all at the fingertips. So connection and mobility have very little to do with cars anymore. Cars are just appliances. They're not the symbol of freedom that we had, because that was the only way we could get out of the house as kids. If you wanted freedom, you wanted connection, you had to own a car and you had to get out of there. Now they lock them in their rooms until they're 30. It's a great life now. I've got all this freedom. What's real and what's imagined is very different now. And cars have very little to do as a symbol of freedom in that environment. So a significant amount of changing attitudes. Plus we've got hyper-urbanisation. That's somewhat a re-urbanisation in places like North America where people moved out of cities in the last 30 years, because of crime and pollution and a range of things. And now they're starting to move back in. In telling environment, the North American continent will see an increase in urbanisation, or the population urbanisation, to above 90%. The global population is going to double in terms of urban areas. Australia already has a high level of urbanisation today, something like 90%. That's going to go up. But it's going to double nearly in the amount of people living in cities. Definitely Melbourne and Sydney. I don't know where they're going to have to start stacking freeways because it's not going to work. So that's creating new problems for cities as a result. Cars are now becoming a big part of the problem. Not only that, employment growth now is happening closer to the CBD. You only have to look in Melbourne, down at Docklands there. Something like 50 or 60% of the growth in Melbourne's economic job growth over the next 5 years is likely to be in the Melbourne CBD, or thereabouts, less than 5 kilometres. But most of the population growth is sitting beyond the boundaries of the 25, 30 kilometre limit. And this is consistent in all cities. Sydney has the extra advantage of the Parramatta city centre, and they're talking about a third city centre, but Melbourne is pretty much locked to a radial model. So car ownership is forcing a big part of the market share. In terms of, think about car ownership just as a tool to get around, moving from A to B. There are other modes in that, but car ownership dominates the market share of distance and flexibility. And that's simply because there haven't been any reasonable, convenient alternatives to that on a day-to-day basis. We've got something called Industry 4.0 coming. This is the next wave of industrialisation in economies. Artificial intelligence, virtual and augmented reality, cryptocurrency, blockchain, you might know it as Bitcoin today, mobile payments, Internet of Things, that's where all devices are connected, infrastructure, robotics and drones, 3D printing, and 5G cellular networks. All these things are going to affect the automotive industry in different ways. And what it's going to do is make something very viable in terms of that spectrum of car ownership, and that's the concept of shared ownership. Not as you probably think about car sharing today, but certainly as an integration, the reasons for ownership are going to be highly diluted. So the model that we're looking at as we go forward, reimagined and reinvented, by 2034, we're going to see some major changes. By the middle of that next decade after the next one, it'll all be over. The new economy will be in play. Today we've got franchise dealerships. They're already starting to see pressure from online purchasing, what's called brand curation, vehicle sharing, autonomous transport systems, and something called omnimodal mobility as a solution, which I'll explain in a moment. Here's a business in the UK that is a car dealership. They have no salespeople. Think about Apple meets Tesla. Okay, they're curated in shopping centres. There's solo test drive solutions in the shopping centre Undercroft, and it's 100% purchased online. Trade-in, finance, delivery, all organised. The people are only there to help guide you, much like an Apple store. They're not on commission. This dealer has 2 stores in the UK, one at Freshwater Shopping Centre in Kent, the other at Westfield Stratford. Those 2 stores are Hyundai's 2 largest selling new car dealers. They've just opened a Jaguar Land Rover at Westfield Stratford. Very successful business. They've taken brand curation online store and turned it into a business. Car2Go. You think you know car sharing in Australia. We're in the car sharing equivalent of dial-up mode at the moment. Okay, car sharing is a station-based round-trip model going forward. It is a process where you can instantly grab a car, drive it in one direction. It's a bit like Uber meets car sharing. The mobility as a service, as a global solution. Think of Netflix for transportation. One app, you pay a subscription, you access public transport, car sharing. Those different states of autonomy come through, with Rocker, Tesla, Car2Go, but the ultimate end game for this will be where autonomy meets car sharing. Zero emissions, zero accidents, zero ownership, zero cost, perhaps, for the future. Thousands of lives will be saved, auto crime would be suppressed, carbon emissions slashed, faster travel times, more leisure time, maybe some soaring productivity, lower cost of living in terms of transport costs today being nearly 20% of household incomes, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, increased active mobility for everyone. This is very positive from a long-term point of view. Parking spaces disappear. More livable cities can occur as a result of these changes. Acting now in what is called the opportunity zone is a very, very important thing. Getting a head start for organisations is much better than reacting in the middle of the fight. There's a lot going on already. Uber running autonomous taxi services. Freight is being delivered without drivers. Groceries are being delivered now in hub and spoke, fully autonomous environments in California. Here's a Car2Go model in Santa Monica in California. 100% electric, free access. How's it free? Think about Spotify meets car sharing. It's advertising. And it's a digital smart screen on the roof that's delivering ads telematically to wherever the car is. So in the danger zone right now, there's a lot of businesses, car makers, car dealerships, auto insurers, transport companies, fuel companies, fuel retailers, grocery retailers, tax and limo companies, accident repairers, auto financiers, discretionary retailers, parking garages, car classifieds, car rental companies, outdoor media. Those big signs on the freeway, they're a big revenue earner, as you know, and even motoring associations. All these businesses might think they're flying. They could be falling. And so that opportunity now, for a lot of businesses to look in that opportunity zone before they get into trouble, is to think about these different business models and how that's going to affect them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. That was fantastic. I bet the newspaper industry wish they'd had you speak to them a few years ago. All right, let us get back to the fantastic. I think everyone's got it. I know I have. So let's get back to the automotive industry today. So those key themes, this quest to zero emissions, driverless cars, urban mobility, making us rethink ownership, and digital disruption are kind of, as we saw, inextricably intertwined. And they're clearly driving us towards a totally different automotive landscape. And the automotive industry today, despite the exit of manufacturing, which we hear a lot about, is actually a very vibrant one. And that was one of the points that Scott was making, is that today it's a vibrant, solid industry. So it's kind of hard to think about the future where everything might change. And the key drivers of the industry and why it's such a vibrant industry, which we'll talk about in a minute, are at first glance really different to the themes of the future. But I think as we work through them, the things that are making the industry vibrant today are actually the precursors of the future that we've actually been looking at. So first of all, with an estimated something like $80 billion in sales of cars, new and used, each year, the automotive industry really matters. It's a big business. And of course, the industry itself is not just about selling cars. It's not just manufacturing and dealers selling cars. It's the businesses that support that. It's the finance business, it's servicing, and all of those things that we've just heard about. And all in all, the industry generates many billions of dollars and many hundreds of thousands of jobs. So some of these numbers of the other industries that we're looking at are really quite staggering. First of all, personal finance up there at $20 billion. The Roy Morgan data shows that there was something like $3.9 trillion of financial services in Australia in 2016, and that includes about 15.6 billion in outstanding personal loans for cars, and then another something like 4.5 billion in car leases. Now, when it comes to personal loans, the major lender was St George, that accounts for about 14% of market share, but then Toyota was next. So Toyota are in that space. When it comes to leasing, the leaders are Macquarie, followed by Toyota. Then when you come to insurance there, that 13 billion, the Roy Morgan data shows basically there's something like 89 or 90% of drivers have some form of insurance, on average $911 a year, so there's your 14 million. Then you look at something like Road Assist, something like 8 million auto club members, so they have an average membership of something like $80, and so again you're up to sort of $6 billion. And then another 1.4 million are protected through roadside programs. Then we've got things to do with fuel. We know that last year we in Australia drove over 254 billion kilometres as a nation, enough to drive to Mars 1,000 times. And this was fueled by fairly low fuel prices, but still, despite the low fuel levels, the average fuel consumption for a passenger car is about 10.6 litres per 100 kilometres, so an annual spend of about $3 billion. And then we've got the money that's spent on media, something like $2 billion spent on just media spend about the automotive industry. And then parking, we actually haven't been able to count an estimate of parking, but in the city of Melbourne alone, there are over 1 million parking transactions every month, and Tullamarine Airport makes around $400,000 per day in parking fees. That's $146 million a year. So there's a lot of dollars going in parking. So these are industries that are obviously part of this whole landscape. And if we look at it now, not just to do with cars and the automotive industry as such, if we look at it through a transport lens, Australians spend something like $117 billion on transport each year. So that's including all sorts of transport, public transport, cars, insurance, all of those things on a yearly basis. About 7% of our national GDP in 2015. And the average family spends something like $17,000 per annum on transport of all different kinds. That's according to the AAA. About 13.6% of the average household income, or closer to 20% if you're actually in the city. So we're spending a lot of money as a nation going places. But today, there's never been a better time to be selling cars. Sounds a bit like Malcolm Turnbull, but it's true. With record new car sales in 2016, again, well over 1 million cars sold, and 2.1 million new used cars sold in 2016. It is still a very vibrant industry. And the record sales that we're seeing have been driven by sort of economic factors, which I'll show you about, trends in the economy, affordability, which relate to trends in the economy and car prices as well as competition and innovation. A whole bunch of new things being offered in cars so that the upscaling of cars has become a little bit like mobile phones. There's more things to say, I want the new one because it's offering these more features. So we talk a lot about economic concerns at Roy Morgan Research. We talk a lot about unemployment, the things that are worrying us. And that's largely because when we ask people what's the biggest issue or the biggest problem facing Australia, it's always to do with the economy. And there's no doubt that's still the case. However, on so many economic measures, Australia's actually doing well. The thing it's not doing well on is unemployment and the gap between the rich and the poor, or the haves and the have-nots, the people who've got jobs and people who haven't got jobs. So there are big issues there, but overall the economy is doing extremely well. Superannuation assets continue to rise, well over $2 trillion. Household wealth continues to rise, about $8.5 trillion, and is outstripping household debt. So as a net, there's more money to spend on things, more money around. Household prices are increasing. While that makes it hard for people to get into the housing market, when people have got a house, they feel like it's fantastic. The value of their house is going up, so they feel wealthier. And consumer confidence is consistently in positive territory. The ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index has been relatively sort of range-bound in that latter part since about 2015. We had lots of ups and downs around the global financial crisis and recovery, but relatively consistent. And in fact, if we draw a line, gently improving. And of course, interest rates are low and relatively stable. Mortgage stress itself is also relatively stable, and that's a function of household income, housing prices, interest rates, and banking practices. Again, the average gives us a particular view. Those people who are in that sort of 10% of people who can't even manage to pay the interest off are really struggling. But on average, this is not a major issue. The relatively high Australian dollar has meant that it was cheaper to import cars, so there's a price issue and affordability thing there as well. One of the other drivers of the growth in the automotive industry is simply the population growth. And over the last decade, Australia grew in size by about 5 million people. That's about 26%. Compared to other established Western countries, that's extraordinary. That level of growth is unprecedented, and the future growth will continue, probably not at that rate. The ABS are predicting we'll hit 40 million people by about 2050. And of course, we're changing as well. It's not just more of the same. So those of you who've been to these presentations before will know that Australia is changing. You know that we're ageing, we're increasingly educated, we're working longer, we've got smaller households, fewer children, there's more renting, more multicultural people from different countries. We're increasingly socially progressive, open to new things, whether that's kind of gay marriage or new technology, and generally less conservative. But we're also seeing some growing concerns for security and safety. There are a couple of key demographic changes that I want to focus on that are really important to note for the particular purpose of the automotive industry. And it's to do with ageing, but there are actually two groups that are growing in the Australian population, and they're at the opposite ends of the age spectrum. So the number of Australians 65 plus is growing. That's now about 3.7 million, up from 2.5 million a decade ago. And that's that baby boomer bump that's moving into the 65 plus group. On the other hand, we've got the lower end, the younger end, the millennials as people call them, up to about the age of 34. They're growing as well. There's an influx of people into that age group, and they are now the largest Australian cohort. They are now sitting at about 5 million people. So this is extraordinary. The two ends of the age group growing, and in fact, the young ones, the millennials, are now the biggest age cohort. They are really the future of the nation, and the baby boomers, of course, are the cashed up present. And so this is another one of those kind of conundrums. Follow the money, but watch the future. This is really creating a very interesting societal shift. So I want to focus a little bit on that just to give us some perspective. The other things that are worth looking at is the actual household level. So the mix is changing, more two-person households rather than larger family households. And clearly that has an impact on the number of cars and the number of cars per household. So fewer cars per household, but more cars in general. And of course, technology is changing. I don't need to show you a billion charts about that. We are more open to technology, and now we've got something like 80% of the population on smartphones. So it's really all happening. So I said we'd focus on these two extremes of the age spectrum. And, you know, what does that sort of mean? Well, first of all, the younger people, the millennials, are much more likely to be early technology adopters. So if on average it's about sort of 19% of the population are early technology adopters, then the younger ones, it's about 32%. And in your 65 plus boomers, it's about 4%. So clearly technology adoption is something that is more likely to be there in the millennial phase. As an example, Uber. Almost 1 million millennials have Uber on their phone or tablet, 18% of all of them. And 2/3 of them have used the app in the last 4 weeks. So Uber lives there. In contrast, only 1% of these 65 plus boomers have downloaded Uber. Much, much lower than the national average. So really two extremes. And only half of those have used it recently. Then we've got sharing. Nearly 200,000 Australians are now using car sharing services, and about half of them are millennials. So it's really happening there, and very few of them are in the baby boomer 65 plus group. Now, both groups, actually, the older people and the younger people, are concerned about environmental problems and environmental issues. But millennials are much more likely to say they'd seriously consider buying electric vehicle or a hybrid than baby boomers. So if you look at millennials, 32% say they'd consider buying an electric car, 50% a hybrid. If you look at the older ones, the figures for boomers are 23% would consider an electric car and about 40% a hybrid. So you can see where this take-up is coming. And that clearly provides unique challenges in terms of how do you communicate the benefits of your car, because basically if we ask people what's important, for the younger people it is technology, it is zero emissions and those sorts of things. For older people it's much more likely to be safety and security, a safe car. Hearing Scott, the future will deliver both. So it's about messaging and it's about how these things are actually presented. And over the last 10 years, the number of millennials and boomers looking to buy new vehicles has increased. Millennials now account for something like 500,000 of new vehicle intenders, whereas the ageing boomers are just under that at about 460. So boomers in the market for a new car have more than doubled, and they're continuing to be interested in buying cars. And drivers. Not only the Australian population, but drivers are also changing. Australia-wide, there are something like 16.3 million Australians who drive a car. That's an increase of 2.5 million over the last 10 years, or 19%. But among that 65 plus cohort, the incidence of driving has increased from 78% in 2006 to 87% in 2016. The older people are more likely to be driving. People are driving longer. The incidence of driving is higher among people over the age of 65 than ever before. On the other hand, among the younger group, and if we look at those people of driving age, say 18 to 24, the incidence of driving, number one, is much lower. Only 67% are driving versus the 87%, but it's decreased over the last 10 years. So younger people, fewer driving than older people, and it's coming down. In 2006, it was 72.5. By 2016, it's 67%. And among the young in the city, it's down to about 64%. So that trend away from car ownership and even driving is already with us. We're already seeing it. And we're actually seeing a change in the kind of cars that people are driving. Just over 7 million Australians are in new cars. That's the blue line. That's a car that they bought new. And the red line shows that something like 9.2 million are in cars that they bought used. So used cars still outstrip cars that were bought new, but you can see the gaps closing over time as more people are actually choosing to buy new cars. And that's to do with a whole range of things, including some of the things we're talking about, a move towards zero emissions. New cars are already providing that kind of trend. Easier, not quite driverless, but it's making it a lot easier, driverless features for the driver as they drive cars. So as a result of this kind of data that we just saw, the average vehicle age has come down a little bit. The average age is now 10 years. A smaller proportion of older cars are on the road. So you can see 25 years plus cars that are over 25. I know yours probably is, Peter, but you're one of the minority, whereas younger cars are actually on the increase. So the shape of the car park is actually changing. And this is all courtesy of our deep automotive industry group, having a look at what's happening really. So SUVs, they tell me, are not taking over the world yet, despite what we hear. It does sound like they might be. What we're seeing, despite all of the hype, basically most of us are still driving passenger cars. That's that blue line. But you can see the light blue line at the top. It peaked at about 2010, 11 with around 11.2 million, and it's starting to trend down. And you can see the red line, which is showing an increased number of SUVs being driven, and the light commercial is that bottom line, the dark blue, which is also gradually increasing. We're also seeing, and we've been tracking the incidence of buying and owning of large cars, because basically as people became concerned about the environment and emissions, the move away from large cars started to trend down. It's very, very clear. You can see large cars, that red line, has really seriously decreased from over 3 million in 2006 down to just over it's nearly 4 million in 2006 to just over 2 million now. So that's basically halved. It's the small cars that are increasing and the other ones are medium coming down a little bit. But basically there's a very stark line away from large passenger cars towards smaller passenger cars. And within the SUV market, we're actually seeing it's the medium and smaller ones that are actually growing at the fastest rate. So the small one is increasing substantially. So a change in the shape of cars and some changes also, which I won't go into here, in terms of the number of cars that people have and whether they choose one SUV instead of two alternatives. Again, looking for fit for purpose. Now, if you just look at the brands, who's doing what? Despite closing up shop, Australians still love our Toyotas. So at a brand level, the top 5 in terms of volume, Toyota remains dominant, but trending down a little bit. Sorry. Oh, Toyota's still really doing really well. 3.5 million people behind the wheel of one of their models. And that's about a 681,000 increase since 2006. Over that same period, you've actually had Ford and Holden trending down, and you've had Mazda and Hyundai picking up. So you can see some fairly substantial changes in the brand share in this whole automotive market. And despite all of the issues around emissions, which are incredibly important for Volkswagen, the group is probably the biggest mover. If we look at the other brands and we take those that have got, say, 100,000 drivers at least, the Volkswagen group has been the major mover since 2006. So the Volkswagen brand has gone up at least threefold. You can see that trend there. Kia's also increased, Mercedes-Benz has almost doubled, and Audi has also been on an increase. Now, these ones are also, each of these cars are moving in the direction of zero emissions. They're moving in the direction of helpful driving, if not driverless, the sort of supported driving that you actually get. And we love our cars. 15 million satisfied drivers and counting. So when it comes to satisfaction, we at Roy Morgan measure companies' satisfaction across banks, across retail stores, across kind of everything that moves, bread shops, coffee shops, etc. People love their cars. When it comes to cars, they are the most satisfied group. So, this is a really interesting point, isn't it? It's that thing about we love our cars, but are they going to be fit for purpose? Is it going to be economically rational? But as we speak, people do love their cars. Now, it's probably partly due to the fact that there are more new cars. If you've just bought a new car, you probably love it. There are more new and beaut features. But there's something a lot more than that. There are lots of other industries that are offering new features and new beaut things. People love their cars. It's one of those things we're going to have a handle on. At what point does it not become a love affair with your car? Okay, so we've had a look at what we might call the national car park and how it's changed over the last decade. Let's look at what's in store for the short term. And that's before the end of 2020, like in the next little while. Which brands are in a really strong position? What type of vehicles are people looking to buy? And which markets will be the key battlegrounds? So first of all, Toyota is still in the driver's seat, but Mazda and Hyundai are closing in. So you can see Toyota's still the big one, but in terms of intention, it's starting to fall down a little bit, and the ones that are picking up are Mazda and Hyundai. So that's in terms of brand. More than 1 million in the market for a new SUV. So SUV is still going strong. So this is the intention to buy in the blue and 10 years ago and now. So you can see small cars up a little bit, passenger vehicles down a little bit in intention, SUVs twice the number of people looking to buy an SUV now than 10 years ago, and light commercial up a little bit. So SUVs are still strong for the foreseeable future. Now, there are more baby boomers entering the market, pretty important. And so we've also seen there are more millennials entering the market, but these are really both set to increase car sales. So the baby boomers are looking to buy more cars. They're more likely to be buying cars. There's still a growing cohort and they're driving longer. So for that baby boomer, particularly the 65 plus group, it's all positive. On the other hand, millennials, there's still growth there, but as we said, they're less likely to be driving, but when they are driving, they're more likely to be looking to buy a new car. So very different sets of dynamics. And boomers are increasingly after SUVs, especially the smaller ones. So here you can see this is the boomer group. They're looking passenger vehicles down, SUVs up like crazy, a little bit of light commercial. So sales look set to continue. There will be winners and losers. As we've already seen, if nothing changed, there'd be winners and losers. But with all the change in the air and with all of the change happening, there will be winners and losers. And just as Scott pointed out, if a company is really big and successful and profitable today, that's no guarantee of success in the future. In many ways, the most profitable companies are the ones that will find it hardest to actually think about and shift. But basically, one of the key things is Australians. Are we ready? We love our cars. We kind of like all of this other stuff. But how ready are Australians to adopt all of these new things? And this is one of the things we're going to have to keep an eye on, because that's where it will all play out. And then, so the key issue for the industry is when? Is this next year? Is it 2025? Have we got till 2050? Can we kind of wait until we all die and it's the next generation's problem? When is a critical thing? And with who? Who's going to lead the chase is also going to be a really, really important one. So, for instance, over the weekend, a driverless car was involved in a crash. Will that stop the whole thing? Will that stop this change in its tracks? There will no doubt be lobbying to the government to say, stop driverless cars. There'll be lobbying to say, stop car sharing. There will be many political forces at play. How will that play out? Nobody knows. Nobody actually knows the answer to these things. But what we've got to do is get a handle on where we are today and monitor. So what are we actually seeing? What did we do? We are Roy Morgan Research, so we went out and asked people. We went and did a survey, and we essentially asked people where they are today, what their thinking is today. If you asked me, I'd say, nah, never going to happen. I always say it's never going to happen, and it always does. So that's why we do research. The majority of Australians, when we ask them, say they would pay more for a car with zero emissions. So 62% said they'd pay more. Some of them, it was less than 5%, but only 38% said no more. It's a statement, it's a mindset. We all know that the majority of people say they would buy Australian if they could, then when price comes into it, they actually don't. So this is a statement of where Australian values and attitudes are today. We have females a little more willing to pay extra. Millennials much more willing to pay extra. 75% of millennials would pay extra for a car with zero emissions. Only 51% of boomers. And more affluent suburbs or more affluent segments, the Helix persona 100s and 200s, the more affluent group, are also more likely to say that they would pay more for a car that has zero emissions. But most Australians are not yet ready for driverless cars. How many people think if we asked you, if you had the option, would you travel in a driverless car? What do we think people would say? 5%, 1%, 100%, 90%? Guess? No guesses. A bunch of researchers. 46% said yes. I found that extraordinary. 46% said yes, they would travel in a driverless car if they had the option. And they're not just all older women who have to put up with their husband's bad driving. Men are more likely than women to say this. Millennials, much more likely. 62% of millennials said yes, only 26% of boomers. And people in urban areas, 48% more likely to want to drive in a driverless car. And again, the affluent suburbs are more likely to say yes. 52% of people living in the very affluent areas, the 100s and the 200s, which tend to be urban, also said yes, they'd prefer a driverless car. Now, car sharing options. Most Australians actually weren't aware of car sharing options. Only 36% of us were aware. 64% said no, they weren't aware of these car sharing options. But as we said earlier, 200,000 have actually done it. And what we see is men a little more aware, 43%, millennials more aware than baby boomers, but really it's the people in inner city, sort of millennials, metro techs, that are really into this. 55% of people in the inner city, metro techs, millennials, are actually aware of these services and are much more likely to be using these car sharing options. A third of Australians are ready to buy cars online. That one surprised me as well. I thought that would be a whole lot higher. We buy so many things online, but a third of Australians are ready now to buy cars online. Would you be willing to and ready to buy a car entirely online without going through a traditional dealer process? 34% said yes. Men more likely than women, millennials more likely than baby boomers, but not by much. And again, it was the more affluent people that are more likely to say yes. All predictable, but that one I was a little surprised that it wasn't a lot higher. So in summary, it really has never been a better time right now and probably for the next year or so to be selling cars. But I think the very same social trends, the economic growth, the openness to new technology, the kind of willingness to try things, a demand for frictionless existence, are the kind of things that are driving the car sales today, and they are also the kind of things that will drive the changes we've been talking about. So what can we all do about it? I wish I had all the answers, and probably everyone hopes, having stayed this long, they'll have the answers. Let me simply say there is no simple answer. Nobody knows how this will pan out. It's quite clear we've got to keep an eye on younger people. We've got to keep an eye on affluent people. We've got to keep an eye on city people. We've got to keep a really good eye on all of the products and services and innovations that are coming in. We've got to look at government legislation, got to look at the implications. We actually believe the best thing to do is that we seek together to try and navigate the future. So Roy Morgan started the ball rolling with these 4 questions, 4 questions to start picking up where we are today. We're eager to continue to monitor that, but we're very eager to invite people for whom this is critical to your future, whether you're in the insurance industry, the automotive industry, whether you're in politics or any of the other industries that are likely to be impacted by this sometime either today, tomorrow or in the distant future, to kind of come together with us, to come together, share your thoughts, your ideas, and what we plan to do is actually start tracking it so that we can see and start to understand, are these things trending like that? Or is there, we've had an inflection point 10 years ago, is there a kind of cliff? Is there a real takeoff like this? What is it? When does it happen? And can we all be at least very aware of it, see it coming before it lands on top of us? So that's our invitation. We expect it'll look something like a tracker where we actually start to track these things, we monitor them over time, we do them within our whole research system, so that we're not just doing like little pulses to say, oh yeah, more people think driverless cars are pretty cool. We're actually knowing who they are. Are they the ones that are critical to the industry? Are they the ones with the money to spend? Are the ones most likely to do it? So that's what we're looking to do. And then we believe that from this will emerge the ability to actually monitor risk and profile risk, to start to look at which brands are most at risk over the coming years, which brands need to start preparing now, and which brands can actually wait a little while. Is it really good to have a massive market share? I think so, but maybe there are brands that are niche that have actually really got it nailed. And this will be about what proportion of your current owners or the ones that you've got really in your sights are in this new world as opposed to today's world. So these are the kinds of things that we'd like to be working on with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.